Ooh. Oh no, how do I do it? I forgot. There we go. There we go. Astora, what's going on? Lovely. Lord help us, Tampa. So early. Your alarm technique is working. That much is apparent. Saturn Ivory on TikTok. What's going on? What's going on? Fun stuff tonight. Good stuff. A little bit of human sacrifice. Never hurt anybody. Fun things. Heartwarming things. Sacrificing your children. Graves. So here's what actually matters, though. Graves, is there a cat in your profile picture? Is that what that is? I know you're at work, so if you need to respond later, you can. But it looks like you are holding a cat or something fuzzy in your picture, and I'm just now noticing it. I heard my name. Yeah, I said hi. That's all. That's all, Saturn Ivory. I said hi. I was being polite, you know? It's a lost art. I understand. It's very weird. But I like it, you know? It's nice to be nice. It's nice to not suck. And I feel like saying hi is a not sucky thing to do. Hey, Mikkel. TikTok, go to YouTube. You can't, I mean, you can kind of see because I figured out how to do techie stuff, but it's very small. Baby, it's very small. So I would recommend going over to YouTube. It's much better. The experience is much better. Okay. Well, I have tight time, so we're gonna jump right in here. Thursday was great. In case you weren't there, highly recommend watching that recording. For some reason, the audio is a little bit off, so I did some playing around with that, and we should be good. You guys just need to let me know if we're not. It was kind of crackly, and I think I know what I did, so I think I fixed it again. But the stuff that we covered on Thursday, if you've watched any of the Adam and Eve streams, it was this circular thing we just kept going over and over and over through with Adam and Eve, and it was starting to get very aggravating. Maybe just me, but it was starting to get kind of aggravating. But Thursday, that all changed, and a bunch of new things happened, and it was really interesting. So if you missed that one, you should watch it, or at the very least, go to the video, go into the description, find the chapters that we read, and go read them. A link to the text that we use is also in the description of the video. At the very least, do that. If you don't want to hear me talk, that's totally fine. But go read, because things changed. We got a little bit of variety finally, and it was really good. It was really good. But tonight, we've got Genesis 22 and 23, right? Right? 21 and 22. No, that's not right. Is that right? It is 21 over 22. Beautiful. Okay. 21, less eventful. 21 or 22, quite eventful. So we're going to try to breeze through 21. The birth of Isaac. And if we have time, we'll talk about some things at the end. Specifically, we'll get there if we get there. 21. The Lord visited Sarah. This happens, like the term or the way that's said happens twice. One time, I hate when it jumps me around. One time here, and then one more time with Hannah and Samuel. Outside of these two, this phrase is not used. So substantial, not substantial, I don't know, you tell me. As he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah. So the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. Talking about the promise that we talked about 100 times throughout previous chapters in Genesis, because God promised Abraham all this stuff and Sarah all this stuff, and then nothing happened. And then not even nothing, but it seemed like the promise was kind of like a con to a degree because of Hagar and Ishmael. And so they thought that was the fulfillment of the promise. And they were both kind of disappointed about that, but Abraham was at least going to give it a shot. He's like, okay, well, I mean, it's not what I thought, but I guess I can make that work. Sarah was not about it at all. We had a bunch of baby mama drama with all that. But then finally the promise happens, the real promise, where they're having the kid. It's their kid. It's their firstborn between the two of them, actually. And they're extremely old at this point, like older than most people live ever at all. And they're bearing children. So the promise was legitimate, and it finally came through. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. And it's funny how the way they're choosing to write all this. Telling Jesus what? What did I do? Cat, what did I do? What happened? Baby mama drama? I don't know. Anyways, it's funny how the terminology kind of changes. Not terminology. The way the author chooses to express things, because of all the history we've had between the two of these and the promise from God and the baby mama drama and all the other stuff, the author feels it very necessary to highlight two things. One is that they're old as hell. He's making this super clear that they're extremely old. Oh, that was that ghost. Okay, got it. They're extremely old. The other thing that the author feels the need to highlight excessively is that Sarah bore this child because the promise was that she would, and then she didn't. And, what they call the slave girl, their housemaid, whatever you want to call it, she bore the child, which caused all of the drama, right? Dang, only 5 minutes late, and I feel like I missed a lot. I promise you didn't. We're like 2 verses in. So anyways, those are two things just like keep in mind, be present with, because that style of writing is going to be all over this, because the promise is finally coming true, and the author wants you to absolutely understand that the promise came true, and that all of the weird stuff that's happened to this point was just, it was tests, or it was irrelevant, and now the promise is actually happening. So Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, who Sarah bore to him, mind you, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, which was the custom. That was the normal custom. That was the covenant. So that's all well and good, all normal. As God had commanded him. Abraham by covenant. Commanded by covenant. I'll add that part because that's important. Abraham was 100 years old, meaning the promise happened 25 years ago. So when you look at it that, allegedly, when you look at it with that perspective, it's like you can kind of understand why this was a difficult deal. 25 years ago, they were promised that they would have kids. And years into that, they think it's happening, but Sarah's not going to be the bearer of the child. And then we have all that drama. So now 25 full years later, they're 100 years old. Abraham is 100 years old. God's like, all right, here you go. This is what you've been waiting for. So 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter. Now, that makes no sense on its face, right? God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. It makes no sense unless you remember chapter 17, verse 17, that said, Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? How old is Abraham right now? He's 100 years old. Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? So how old is Sarah now in that 10-year gap? This is one of those ones that you have to wonder. Was this planned? Or is this an author making the story easier to understand? Because what this means is that in chapter 17, when the angels, one being Yahweh, came to Abraham and Sarah at the tents, right? It was only a couple chapters ago. And he's telling him again, like, no, this is going to happen. You're going to have a kid. You're going to have tons of grandchildren. You will become the nation. And Abraham laughed at God. He's laughed. And then sarcastically was like, is a child going to be born to a man that is 100? Okay, fast forward to now. Abraham's 100. And now it's all happening, right? So who would have said to Abraham, continuing at 7, and she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So it is all happening here, finally. It is all coming together. What happened? What did Pia do? Approved side approved side chick. Are we talking about Hagar as an approved side chick? Who gets to decide whether she's approved or unapproved as a side chick? And is she considered a side chick? There's got to be a different term for that, I feel like. I feel like there's a better term, a different term, maybe. Unless I'm just totally out of loop with what you guys are talking about. Okay, God protects Hagar and Ishmael. Now we're going to have even more drama. Verse 8. And the child grew and was weaned. Now, one interesting thing about like the weaning process, obviously every living thing that nurses weans. We've had weird cultural things where like kids at 7 were still weaning, and it gets a lot of blowback and pushback and stuff. It was no different really back then. Most accounts will say that children weaned at a slower rate or for longer than what kind of the average is nowadays. But even if you compare like culture to culture in this part of the world during this time period, there was a lot of variety even then. So there's been arguments in academia about what the weaning process was for like Israel, and even around the time of Jesus, I've seen some, but much more so towards like the Jewish side of things, the Jewish history side of things, which is just like a funny thing. So if you ever have extra time and you're interested to watch a bunch of scholars argue about how long children went through the weaning process, that content does exist, just in case you ever want to do that. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned, because it's a big deal. It's the removal of, it's the detachment of, it's the growth process beginning. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had born to Abraham, laughing. This seems to be a theme. Hagar, in case you haven't been with us and you're not familiar with the stories fully, Hagar is the Egyptian housemaid, slave, whatever word you want to use. The Bible will call her a slave often, who bore Abraham's first child, which we're going to talk more about him. But that's the baby mama drama. That's what we're talking about. Promise was given to Sarah and Abraham. During the time of the promise not being fulfilled, Hagar is to have a child with Abraham, so they do that. Sarah gets super upset about it, understandably so. Becomes a big dramatic thing, sends her away, brings her back. There's this whole big thing. But anyway, so Abraham has a son with Hagar. That's who we're talking about here. So Hagar, the Egyptian, who was the housemaid, who was the slave, who had borne a child to Abraham, is laughing now. So she said to Abraham, this is Sarah now. Sarah said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, which is also Abraham's son. For the son of the slave woman shall not be heir with my son, Isaac. Which like makes sense. Agree with it or disagree with it. You got to get where she's coming from. Verse 11. And the thing was very displeasing. The thing being what Sarah just said was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. Because again, that's his son. It's not Sarah's son. It's not their son, but it's Abraham's son. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. Do as she tells you. That's not something you see often in the Bible, but it does happen. Do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Which what he's saying is that this, because he is your son, and because I have had a prior arrangement with you, because God and Abraham have talked about this son, he will be taken care of. What I told you would happen will happen. Don't fret, baby boy. All will be well. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Named meaning value, significance, right? 13, and I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also because he is your offspring. confirmation of the promise previously given from God to Abraham. 14. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. So Abraham's doing what he was told. Sarah, upset, send the slave girl and your son, Abraham, not mine, away. Abraham not pleased about this. God's like, nah, don't worry about it. It's fine. Let's appease her. All will be well. That's not really what the context is, but that's how I interpret it sometimes. It's like, nah, just do it. Just do it. It's not worth it. All is well. The promise is fulfilled anyways. The kid's going to do what he needs to do. This is all irrelevant at this point. Let's get rid of the drama. And so he sends her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. Adjacent mistress. I like that. That's really good. An adjacent mistress. That's really good. The thing is, we need to understand that at that early stage, Abraham was just getting to know God. He and Sarah, Abraham's sister. Yeah, I mean, true. So that's why all the laughing. That's true, though. It's true. It's not an invalid point. It's possible, but we don't know for sure. Hey, Nat. Not only that, but his first son. Right, like that's the thing, is it great that it wasn't Sarah's kid? Like, ideal would be that it was, but it's still Abraham's kid. Now, I feel like if the roles were reversed and Sarah had this kid and Abraham's like, F your kid, send it away, Sarah would probably be like, that sucks. I'd prefer not to, actually, if we could avoid this somehow. Regardless of it, I think it's a tough situation either way. Like, it's one of their kids. It's still their kid. I heard he had a third wife. Where from the Bible or from extra biblical texts? The mic is not on. Thank you. Thank you for doing your job wonderfully. Let me do that real quick. All right, the Discord stage is now on. So we're all good. All three, Abraham, his sister, wife Sarah, approved side chick, adjacent mistress, Mikkel, adjacent mistress, Hagar, they were all cracking up at this God they barely knew. Keturah, yes, Prima, I remember something about that. YouTube always cuts off part of the chat. I read something about that. Where are you guys getting that from? I don't remember this. Now I feel like I'm out of the loop. I'm officially starstruck. TikTok, what does that even mean? What does that even mean? Okay. When the water in the skin, so Hagar gets sent away, blah, blah, blah. Big dramatic thing. When the water in the skin was gone, so she runs out of water, she put the child under one of the bushes, because that makes sense. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, let me not look on the death of the child. That's rough, brutal. And she sat, she sat opposite him. She lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? I want to read this because I thought this was an interesting way to look at that. The angel of God called to Hagar. The interchange of God who hears in this verse, and the angel of God who then speaks, shows a blurring of the distinction between the two. This is because the angel is speaking on behalf of God, or is God in a form. Both of Abraham's sons, Ishmael and Isaac, are saved by the angel calling from heaven. I'm going to read it one more time because it's interesting, but you have to think about it for a second. Let me read the verse again first. So 17 said, and God heard the voice of the boy. God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, and what this interpretation or this explanation is saying is the interchange of God who hears, God heard the voice of the boy, who hears in this verse, and the angel of God who then speaks, when the angel of God then called to Hagar, what troubles you, shows a blurring of the distinction between the two, God and the angel. This is because the angel is speaking on behalf of God, or is God in a form. Both of Abraham's sons, Ishmael and Isaac, are saved by the angel calling from heaven, which is true. I thought that was a very interesting way to look at that, and thought-provoking if nothing else, because it is a very odd way for this to be written. God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar. Different interactions, different individuals on the human level. But you could argue on the non-human level as well. It's interesting. God listens to the innocent. I like that. Rodriguez, let me see. My screens are all messed up, sorry. All right, you should be able to, there you go. Yeah, pull up that Genesis verse real quick. Oh yeah. Yeah, so yeah, no, I did not remember this at all. But we're a couple chapters away. But so Rodriguez asked earlier about the third wife of Abraham, which I did not remember, but Mikkel confirmed, and they found it. So in Genesis 25, which is a little bit ahead of where we're at, Abraham had taken another wife whose name was Keturah. I don't remember the context of this. Was it an additional wife or after death? Okay. Okay. Interesting. Oh. Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, there's a fine line. Okay, well that's interesting. So yeah, we'll get into that, I guess, here shortly then. A couple, or maybe next week probably. I forgot all about that. Thought provoking. You said something else. It's been a great relationship for him to laugh at what God said. I don't know about that. I think I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if I would have the gall to laugh at God while he said something to me, especially like at least the way it's described to us is that God is physically there, and he wasn't alone. So it's not only just like God there, which would be enough, but there are other angelic beings there. Like, I don't know. I don't know if I'd have it in me to be able to laugh. Very ballsy. But we will get to that on chapter 25. Yeah, right. So if I just blow past it, which is very unlikely, but if I do when we get there, somebody tell me to shut up so we can talk about it. Because I do want to go into the context of that a little bit. But so the wife dying, so I believe that is it. I think Rodriguez right about that. Okay, so she runs out of water. She sets the kid down under the bush. Then we have this very interesting and odd description of how God comes to the child, which what Mikkel said was interesting, is that God listens to the innocent. I think that's an interesting way to look at it too. And then the angel of God calls to Hagar. He says, "What troubles you? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation." So there's the confirmation of the promise, which is a big part of why Abraham did not have as much of a problem, at least from what we can tell, with them being expelled from his presence, because God had confirmed to him just previously that the previous promise, their interaction about what this boy's life will be like, was confirmed and all good to go. And now Hagar is getting the confirmation of the promise too. Then God opened up her eyes and she saw a well of water. What they needed was water. Water is now provided. This happens a lot in the Old Testament. It happens a lot in other religious texts of this time period, is that the section will preface by an issue. There will be a problem. So in this case, the problem was they ran out of water. Then there will be an interaction between divinity and the human that usually has something to do with something prior, not the immediate problem, which in this case was water. And in this case also, the previous problem was what's going to happen to the child. Then after that, you have the solution to the immediate problem, along with the confirmation of the previous problem. It's a really common way that authors did things during this time period. So when you read stories like this, whether it's in the Bible or something else, It's extremely frequent that you'll see that kind of literary setup and how that is explained. Just something to like keep an eye out, because the Bible does it a lot, but it happens all over the place. Like a lot. Mesopotamian texts have it, Egyptian texts have it. It's very, very similar across the board. So, immediate solution to the immediate problem of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy. And he grew up. God was with the boy is important too, because that phrase is used, obviously, it has a lot of depth to it. It doesn't necessarily mean he's standing right there with him. God was with, in the Jewish text specifically, is like a very meaningful phrase. And it means on a very deep level spiritually, God has a plan and a purpose for the boy. God is with the boy. And he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. This also is kind of interesting, because when you get later into the Old Testament, we know from two other sections that they did. Not just him, but that whole lineage became like experts at marksman. Interesting. So it's one of these things that like is said in passing, but is confirmed when you continue on and you read more of the Bible. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. A treaty with Abimelech. Here we go. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my descendants, or with my posterity. But as I've dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me and with the land where you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. I will swear is all throughout the Old Testament, and again, like outside of the Bible too, because it's just time period. This was like the contract before a contract, and this is why for a lot of people it's very depressing to see now that in current society your word means nothing. Like nobody believes anybody's word. It's absolutely valueless. Back in the day, this was like a handshake 200 years ago. If you break the handshake, like you're going to die. Somebody's going to kill you, because that was a contract. That's all you needed. A handshake and your word, and that was it. Back then, it was just your word. So they would swear, and that's where we get that from. That's why people say, I swear. It comes from when you used to swear, and that was a contract. That was a legally binding in their society, and by death contract. I will swear, those words. That's it. You break that contract in many cultures, you're dead. You're going to die, because that was the agreement. So Abraham swears. It's a solemn swear, an absolute contract of agreement. When Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me. I have not heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. The covenant is an additional promise. That's it. I swear is going to be a covenant. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? He said, these 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, and this may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore, that place was called Beersheba. Abraham, actually, we'll come back to that. This place is called Beersheba. Oh no, now I lost it. It jumps me around so much, it kills me. There it is. Because there both of them swore an oath. The oath is the I swear. The I swear is the oath. The oath and the I swear is a covenant. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. Now, a couple things here I want to pull from Logos, because it was interesting. 1 second. Okay, so the land of the Philistines. Logos had this. Abimelech was king of Gerar. We know from chapter 20. Gerar is here identified as being in the land of the Philistines, which is that verse we just read. In the parallel story about Isaac and Abimelech, Abimelech resides in Gerar and is specifically called king of the Philistines. We know that from 26, which we obviously have not gotten to yet. So we'll talk about it more when we get there. However, Isaac may be encountering Abimelech's son, which is interesting, which is why we'll talk about it when we get there, because that is a possibility. And there had been confusion, or probably still is, and I'm probably just not in the loop anymore. But I have heard a lot of confusion about the two verses that they conflict. They might not conflict. It might be that Isaac later is not talking to Abimelech, but rather his son, which would very quickly clear that up and make it make sense. He planted a tamarisk tree. This was something that they did to, it was like a divine communication of sorts. It's one of these other things that you get no explanation or understanding whatsoever of what the hell they're talking about or what this is. But if you exit the Bible and you get into other Jewish texts, you'll see and you'll be like, oh, okay, understood. It's a commemoration. It's that simple. But here it's just like a confusing thing that you read past and you pretend like you didn't read it because it didn't make sense to you. Then Beersheba, another thing. Not a lot of context. Logos had this though, and I thought it was really well and simply said. This place name means either well of the oath, which would make sense, or well of seven, which would also make sense, which is why translations are very hard. Well of the oath makes sense because Abraham was talking about the well. Well of seven also makes sense because of the 7 ewe lambs. There are 7 lambs mentioned in 30, and the 2 men swear an oath at that point. As this verse indicates, either meaning will involve wordplay, which is obvious, which is another one of those things that you consistently have to think about, specifically in the Old Testament, less so in the New Testament, of these things just making too much sense, almost. That it seems as though authors are taking liberty in trying to make things make more sense, which usually you have to abandon some literal truth in order to bring in these types of things. Not always, and I'm not saying that's the case. I'm saying it's something you need to think about. God was with him in the wilderness. For him to become the expert with the bow, he had to have a mentor like Luke Skywalker had. It's just one of those things, man, that like nobody thinks about that. Nobody talks about that. But that one verse, if you then cross later into the Bible, you're like, oh, sure, that did happen. He was an expert with the bow. His people became expert marksmen, and we get confirmation of it through stories later on. It's just like an interesting thing that I was never taught. Also, is God asking rhetorically? He knew what was going to happen. He knew what was going on. So I feel like he knew why she was upset. Oh, that was from earlier. Yeah. I think everything God does, I guess, could be deemed as rhetorical, depending on your view theologically of God. Ruth. Dinner is important. Good work. Hopefully it is good dinner. Okay, there was one more thing here, I feel like. We did Beersheba, the land of the Philistine, and the tamarisk tree. All right, maybe not. 22. Now the hot stuff. Taking your child to sacrifice them because God told you to. I feel like it's the atheistic favorite section of the entire Bible. The sacrifice of Isaac. What's that? Yeah, here's the thing though, and we'll get into it. Like, it makes no sense when you read this. When you actually read this and you step outside of like the preconceived understanding of the story, the idea that Abraham at any point really thought that he was killing his son, it doesn't make sense in context. So let's read it, and then if you guys disagree with me, cool, and we can talk about that. I think it's obvious the entire time that this was not happening. So after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, exclamation point. And he said, here I am, as if God did not know where he was. Super common in the Old Testament, right? The here I am, after God calls out to you, is one of these things that happens frequently. So it's not God didn't need to know where he was, right? At least that's what most people believe. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. There's a lot here. So, one, we know now that God is not in favor of human sacrifice. At the time of the writing, you can only speculate. We know now, because we have this collection of texts we call the Bible, where it is abundantly clear God was about sacrificing animals, however you feel about that, PETA, but God was not about sacrificing humans. Never was. There's no reason to think that at all. Gods during this time period, outside of Judaism, were about it, which is why it's relevant. Pagan religions, which again, pagan is like this umbrella term for tons of different types of religions. Pagans as like a sole religion is not real. I don't know why that became a thing. That is not real. Pagan describes hundreds of different religious types of practices. But a lot of these weird religions were very much about human sacrifice. It was a very big thing. Even after Jesus, it continued to be a very big thing. Even today, there is indication that this is still happening to some degree. You have no reason to believe that from Jewish texts. You have no reason to believe that later on from any Christian text. It's just not real. So we know that. And then biblically, now because we have the big picture, we know in Leviticus, we know in Deuteronomy, there are direct statements against this type of thing. All of that said, God then says, take your son, your only son, Isaac. Interesting there to point out, is Isaac Abraham's only son? No. So what does that mean? There's, like always, there's argument about it. I'm under the belief that it's just an identifier of the value and the promise, because that's been the most relevant thing of Abraham as a whole. Like, Hagar was relatively irrelevant. Big picture, not as a human. She was relevant as a person. But big picture of like the actual story that is trying to be expressed here, she was, you could take her or leave her. She has nothing to do with like the actual big theological promise that will become yada, yada, yada. But that's not to say the kid isn't. Hagar just kind of is. But the kid is irrelevant in terms of the promise. Like it or hate it, he is. The kid, we could take him or leave him. In terms of the big picture promise that God made to Abraham in the very beginning, he's irrelevant. So to me and many others, but there are also many who don't agree, is that that's all it is. Go ahead. Oh, we'd have to get it if you want a word for word. Go ahead. No, but the promise was related to Sarah specifically. Yeah, I know that for sure. But if somebody can find the first time God and Abram make the promise that is the promise, if somebody can find that, because I don't want to waste a bunch of our time finding it, but if someone can find it, the promise was given to Abraham and Sarah. I know that for sure.
Get the concept by default, but when she didn't, when she laughed, right, and it's almost like, oh, someone can't hear me.
I fixed it.
Oh, okay, my bad. So I guess by default, I'm wondering if she says no, really it's kind of like whoever he impregnates, because like I hear you, I get what you're saying and I agree, but technically God gave the promise to Abraham.
I don't want to say without us finding the verse, but I'm almost certain it was given to both of them. But I'm definitely open to being wrong. So then let's play it out all the way then. So say I'm wrong, which is definitely possible. And it was given more broadly to Abraham. Then you could argue that. So then what I would do personally is then I'd personally go through the rest of Genesis from then to now, and I'd pull every section where God was talking to Abraham about the promise and see how much Sarah, if at all, was involved in the conversations. And that would help me kind of indicate, was she a part of the promise or was she not? I don't have all that, so I'm not going to say.
Right. And to some degree, I hate saying it, but I mean, let's be real. They don't really mention women too much, especially in these books like that. So if there is a dialogue, it doesn't. Anyways, but yeah, that's probably my only thing, only because you see God listening to Hagar and her concerns. And it's almost like by default, because God promised, he's, I guess, fulfilling his end of the promise and whatnot. Anyways, yeah, because later on, I don't want to jump ahead, but basically later on when he is with Keturah, he also has more kids. So,
yeah.
But anyways, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're not wrong. And if anybody finds that, just throw it in the chat, whatever the verse is. And if we don't get to it, I'll try to find it after, and then maybe I can bring it back next week. But she made good points. Yeah, you could absolutely look at it that way. If you do that, then what you kind of have to answer for is, what the hell is God talking about here? Take your son, your only son. You have to figure out a way to make it make sense. And the toughest thing about it is you have to figure out a way to make it make sense in coherency with all the other choices you make in interpretation in the Bible, which is not as easy as it seems. And it's why Christians look crazy, because we'll logically identify a structure to an interpretation, and then something that's tied to that structure will interpret a different way. And then they conflict. And then we either don't realize they conflict, or we pretend like they don't because we don't want to deal with it. And it's developed kind of the culture that we're in. So I think it's super healthy to do what Rodriguez is doing right there. I think you have to do that. So that if that's your goal, or if you agree with Rodriguez, which I don't disagree, I'd have to look at him, like I said. You then have to make sense of that. Why is God saying your son, your only son, Isaac? Because it's not. And there's no way to argue that it is. So you'd have to figure out some way to make that make sense scripturally. And if anybody has it, I'd love to hear it. I can't. So again, what I would do personally, if I cared to try to figure this out or have a clear picture of it, find the initial promise between God and Abram, because it was prior to Abraham. Find that section. And then from there to now, whenever the promise is talked about, how much is it given to Abraham individually, or is it given to Sarah and Abraham as a couple? And if it's individually, then you have to figure out how to make this make sense. But if it's given to, or seems like it's given to them as a couple, then this does make sense, because this is their firstborn son. It's their only son as a couple. And then this is more cohesive. But then, yeah, then you get to 25, you get the next wife, you get other kids. But that's kind of post-promise. It's not firstborn son anymore. Like, you could make arguments like that, I guess.
It looks like, so if you look in the concordance, I'm sure I'm not saying it correctly, but the word is Yahid for that section where it says only son. And that literally translates only. Right. Solitary.
Right.
Only begotten son. So there's no other speculation for anything else, but...
Right, which is why I think that some people they assign the value to it, that the Hebrew is referencing value only, not number. That's kind of the expression. I think if you look in some of the like exegetical literature about it, you'll see, if I remember right, that they'll say it's reference of value, not number, which is kind of a slap to the face to the other kid. But again, like in context of the promise, I guess it makes sense. It's just one of those things. You got to figure out how to make it make sense. I'm slightly late, but the word for only son pertaining to Isaac in the Septuagint is the same word used for Jesus being the only son of God. It just means unique offspring. Right.
Well, solitary only son is what it actually says in the concordance.
If anybody gets to the bottom of their view of it, I would love to hear it. It's one of those ones, like, and you could argue it kind of does matter. If you're a student of trying to figure this stuff out, it's not really an irrelevant one. It's one that, like, it'd be good to have a full understanding of why God said that, at least like from your view. It's interesting. Okay, so take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There was another note here from Logos that I wanted to read. Hold on. Okay, so for Moriah, the term occurs only here and in 2 Chronicles 3:1, which I did not know, where it is described as a mountain. 2 Chronicles 3:1 notes that Mount Moriah is where Yahweh appeared to David, That much I think most people who read the Bible understand and remember. So it appeared to David, Yahweh appeared to David on the threshing floor of Ornan, the Jebusit, and in turn where Solomon built the temple. Just information. Just information. Things to keep in the back of your head. And then offering him there as a burnt offering. Abraham is commanded to slay Isaac, the son through whom God promised an abundance of descendants. And then they do reference here, if anybody cares to look into it, Genesis 12, 1 through 3, and then 15, 1 through 6. I don't know if that's the beginning of the promise, but that looks close. But I think it started sooner. Despite the absurdity of the command, Abraham obeys. I will personally send you proof. I don't even know what the argument is. It has to be a couple blessing because of Sarah's matrix being blessed for the blessing to take place with an offspring. Am I just not reading that right? It has to be a couple blessing because of Sarah's matrix being blessed for the blessing to take place with an offspring. I'm not understanding. It's good to see you though, but I'm not understanding. If you want to say that in a different way. Which one?
And I put it in the chat, Joe.
17? That's too late.
Genesis 17?
Yeah, it started sooner than that, for sure.
The promise?
Yeah, it at least goes back to 12.
Can I just read it really quick?
Yeah, for sure. Go ahead.
Genesis 17:16, and I will bless. Okay. We'll start 15. Then God said to Abraham regarding Sarai, your wife, her name will no longer be Sarai. From now on, it will be Sarah, and I will bless her and give you a son from her. Yes, I will bless her richly, and she will become the mother of many nations. Kings of nations will be among her descendants. So there's no speculation.
So there.
I'm glad.
Yeah. I mean, it's easier, right?
Yeah.
No, I like that you pointed all that out though, and that made me think.
Yeah, you have to. You never know.
No, it's a really good lesson, if nothing else. Yeah, I currently believe Abraham kept Sarah in the dark, both on the promise, she shall be a mother of nations, and later on God's sacrificial request of Isaac. I agree with you on half. I agree that I think it indicates here in a minute, we haven't got to it yet, but there's clear indication that Abraham does not tell anybody what he's doing. And he actually, he insinuates when he talks to people that they're both going to come back from the mountain, which is a part of why I have the theory that I have. But I don't know if I agree that Abraham kept Sarah in the dark on the promise. I think it was pretty clear, but I'd have to read it again. Like I hate talking about things that aren't right in front of my face. The Bible's too complicated. But I think like even what Rodriguez just said, it seems to indicate that it was given to both of them. But you could definitely argue, like, is it super clear that Sarah was within earshot? I know the only one you can argue with was, was it 17 or later when the angel and Yahweh meet them at the tents? We know that Sarah was a part of that conversation. We know that she heard because there was laughing involved. And there was clear indication that from the other tent or something to that effect, Sarah could hear what Yahweh was saying. So at least in that regard, I think it'd be hard to argue. But before that, I'd have to reread it. I just don't remember that well off the top of my head. One of a kind equals unique. I'm not arguing about me reading the concordance. Oh my God. A couple blessing. I agree. I think it was a couple blessing. I think they both received it. Maybe he got more than her. Maybe he was spoken to more than her. Without reading it, I would assume that is the case because that is pretty consistent with how all of this goes. But it seemed to me that Sarah was pretty involved in a lot of it and kind of seemed to understand. Also with Hagar, Sarah knew, she was very confused by why Hagar was going to get the kid with Abraham because it was hers. It was supposed to be her. She was like, it's supposed to be me. Why am I not having the kid? So I think she was pretty well understood on what the promise was. But it'd be interesting to go back and just pick apart all those different sections and get an absolute clear picture of it. Okay, so take your son, land of Moriah, offer him as a burnt offering, offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Future tense. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled the donkey, and took two of his young men with him. Two of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him, which we were not a part of. We were not a part of God telling him where to go. Just one of those things. On the third day, meaning it took 3 days to get there, that's how we're to understand that, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. That's only important if you intend on doing geographical studies of things, which is also why the thing I read on Moria would be important out of Second Chronicles, because this is how you try to put together a picture of where things actually were and what the travel was like and all of that fun stuff. So we know that from where Abraham was, he's now able to see it after a 3-day trip. Then Abraham said to his young men, plural, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." So Abraham tells the two men, which were servants, that him and Isaac were going to leave. But the way he says that indicates that they are both going to come back. They will both return. Now, there are some that believe that Abraham was concealing the actual purpose of what he was doing with Isaac, which is kind of what Mikkel said, keeping people in the dark.
Yeah, he lied.
Right. However, the book of Hebrews, if you look in chapter 11, takes it as a statement of Abraham's his faith. So if you go to Hebrews and you read 11, one sec, it's 11, 17 through 19. It's depicted rather than a keeping of in the dark as a statement of faith that God would raise Isaac from the dead and bring him back. So then Abraham would not be lying. The other interpretation that's relatively common from what I understand is that Abraham would take the child with, knew that the child would be provided for, meaning replaced with an animal for sacrifice, full confidence. And that's why he said they would both come back.
I guess, like a faith.
Yeah, so two different kinds of faith. The Hebrews faith is that they believe Abraham knew or believed that God would raise Isaac from the dead, therefore both would come back. The other faith statement would be that Abraham believed a replacement would be provided once on the mountain, and then Isaac and Abraham would come back. So like two interpretive options for the faith side of things. Otherwise, it kind of defaults to what Mikkel said, which is he's keeping them in the dark. He lied to them.
Right.
Just one of those things. You got to think about it. But the Hebrews bit is interesting when you kind of cross-reference. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father, Abraham, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." This lights a fire under my ass. So here, Isaac says to dad, "Hey dad, my father." Abraham says back, "Here I am." Go study that for 10 years because it never ends. "Here I am, my son." Earlier, God tested Abraham, said to him, "Abraham." Isaac said, "Father." Abraham said, "Here I am." Abraham says, "Here I am." It's an echo. It seems kind of irrelevant, but it's not when you get into other things in the Bible, kind of, but other texts in Jewish history, Jewish literature. It's actually really, really interesting. The echoing process in a lot of old Hebrew literature. It can mean a million different things. Depending on context, it has a poetic kind of edge to it. But it's something that if you care or you're interested to look into. Old Hebrew literature echoing, and you can use 22 as an example because you will be able to find information on it. But just one more time in case you didn't grasp it. Earlier at the very beginning of 22, God says to Abraham, Abraham. He yells to him, Abraham. Abraham replies, here I am. Then Isaac later says to Abraham, Father. And then Abraham responds, here I am. It's a perfect echo. Continuing, he said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? So Isaac is now privy to that something is off. We have built the altar, which was done very specifically. If it's something you care to study, look into it. But it was built very specifically in a very specific manner, all set up, and they would have the animal with them because the animal would have made the trip to the sacrifice site with them. Isaac had to have already been confused because they didn't have an animal with them. So then you think about, well, what the hell did Isaac think was going to happen? Some will say that he thought that perhaps the donkey would get sacrificed and they would walk back. Or perhaps, worst case, maybe one of the servants was getting sacrificed. It's one of those things like we'll never know. But here, now it's just the two of them and they don't have a donkey. It's just them
Do we know
alone.
about how old they are? About how old he is? We don't know.
Who, Isaac?
Yeah.
No, we don't know. I mean, obviously old enough to speak, obviously old enough to travel, but no, there's no specificity. But here now he's fully privy to that something is off, something is wrong. Where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. This is another one that can be interpreted different ways. Abraham saying, God will provide for himself the lamb for my burnt offering, my son. The number of times I've argued with somebody because they say what Abraham is saying is that my son is an indication to Isaac that it is you that is getting sacrificed. To which I reply, do you not understand English grammar? God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, comma, my son, my child, my love, my friend. What the hell are you talking about? That's not how grammar works. But it's super common that people will make this argument. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. He's not saying, my son, you are the burnt offering, because that is not proper English. And this is an English translation of the Bible. And then if you look in Hebrew too, there's no reason to believe that is what's being said. So rather, the interpretation, in my opinion, and I'm very confident about it, which I don't say often, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. He's reassuring Isaac that something will be provided. And he's very confident about it. So they went, both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, which again, we were not privy to, we were not a part of it, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in the order and bound Isaac. So this is the build. This is that specific, I jumped the gun. This is the specific build of the altar where now everything is all set. Everything is ready to go up in flames. So he built the altar there and laid the wood in order. That's the specificity. And bound Isaac, his son, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Interesting that we have no back and forth at that point of from Isaac asking like, hey, where's the lamb, Dad? And Dad being like, it'll be provided, son. Don't worry about it. We just jumped to Isaac being bound in place of the lamb to be sacrificed. So he bound his son Isaac, laid him on the altar on top of all the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. This was interesting too. Abraham is commanded to slay Isaac, the son through whom God promised an abundance of descendants. This is from Logos, and promised an abundance of descendants. They're here referencing 12 and 15 again. Despite the absurdity of the command, Abraham obeys. The absurdity is a part of why I have the theory that I have, or the interpretation that I have, that Abraham at no point really thought this was happening, because of the language, but also because of the big picture. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. Logically makes no sense, which doesn't mean it's not real, but it makes it unlikely. So we go through 25 years of God promising this child that will create the nations. And then Abraham is to believe that he's going to kill the kid. It's a child, so no nation has been built. If you put yourself in the shoes of Abraham and you have a functioning brain, it makes no sense. After everything that's happened, the number of years that have passed, the confirmation and reconfirmation of this promise for Isaac, he's just going to kill the kid? Makes no sense. Makes zero sense. And then if you get into the actual language, the one that I already pointed out, but it continues, and I'll point him out, but it just doesn't appear that that's actually what's happening. It appears that that's how people started to interpret the story. And then that is one of these things that just takes off. But the actual text, in my opinion, does not reflect that as reality. And the bigger picture, just thinking about what is happening, it makes no effing sense whatsoever. Abraham has to be an idiot to actually think that's happening. And if that is actually happening, life is over. Abraham's life is over. This was the whole thing that was going to set his entire life to give it meaning at all. His life becomes immediately meaningless. This was the thing. This was the promise. This was everything. So if God's just going to wipe it out, there's nothing else. It's over. It's done. And then none of the rest of the Bible basically happened. I think I lean towards your interpretation, Joe. I think it's one of those things, like, really look at it and really think about it and see where you land. But it's one that I went into really hard when I was doing like apologetics, because it's the atheist's favorite story. And I finally got to a point where I'm like, none of this makes any sense when you actually think about it. This is a very odd scenario. How much time passed between the actual event and when it was written? That I'd have to look. I don't remember.
I do have a question though. Do we even know that Isaac was a willing participant? Like, I understand he asked and then we don't hear from him anymore, but like it says he was bound, but we don't really know if it was by force or not.
We don't know. I would assume, maybe against the grain of Christian culture, that he was not voluntarily doing this.
Yeah,
That would be my assumption. But like you said, we have nothing to base it off of, really. I would assume not.
Yeah.
Because Isaac wouldn't understand what's happening. And there's no indication from what I remember that Isaac is having any interactions with Yahweh at all. So it seems as though, like, oh, my dad's just trying to murder me or sacrifice me. Like, so Isaac would have to have equivalent faith in Abraham that Abraham has in God, which it could be. It's one of those things, like, we don't have indication of it.
Oof.
Abraham knew that by him loving God with all his heart, that God would give Abraham all the desires of his heart. I mean, true. After going through some stuff, though. Okay, so Isaac is bound, laid him down. We have no communication from Isaac asking about where's the lamb, dad saying, it'll come, don't worry about it, and then strapping the kid down on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. 11. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, what? He said, here I am, which is another mirror. So we've had 3 so far, of a call out and an answer to. If you're a weirdo, look into this, because it's very interesting in all the Hebrew literature. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God. For now I know that you fear God. Fear God, why? Why is he saying that? Because he was willing to kill the child to make this happen. Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know you fear God. Seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, there's that again, from me. The identity between the angel and God, again, is blurred, which happened earlier. So I'm going to read it again. 11 said, but the angel of the Lord, called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. From me. This is that same odd thing. This is not a common thing in the Bible. This is an odd thing. These are odd things. So again, if you're weird, look into it. It happened in 21, and now it's happened in 22. It happens elsewhere, but it's not a super common thing. where in the same structured sentence or structure of sentences, sometimes you have this intermingling of angel and God in communication to a person or people. And there are endless ways to try to look at this. No matter what, it's always interesting to read about them and to try to think about it. So that's just another one. If you want it, if you care, it's 22, 11, and 12. You have the intermingling of God and angel, the blurring of the lines, where the angel speaks from what we read, the angel speaks in first person as God, but then also refers to God in the third person. And it's not the only time, but it's infrequent. So it's interesting and is worth noting. Seeing you withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of a son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord, it shall be provided, which is what Abraham said earlier. He said God will provide the lamb being an interchangeable way of saying a sacrificial offering. So then he names the mountain that. And the angel of God called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, repetitive, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. The interesting thing is that nothing new is said here. This is a reiteration of what has been promised the entire time. The entire time. Nothing's gone, nothing's added. So Abraham returned to his young men, the slaves who he had wait while he went to do his thing, and they arose and went together to Beersheba. So he then did what he said he was going to do. He took Isaac away, and he said he was going to bring them back. So he brought them back. That's what happened. And Abraham lived at Beersheba. Now, after these things, it was told to Abraham, behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. Now, it's then just names, right? Logos had this, though, and I thought this is worth saying. Two phrases provide a possible explanation for the genealogy's placement here after the binding of Isaac. Kemuel, the father of Aram, and Bethuel, father Rebekah. These two details indicate that Rebekah is related to Abraham and Isaac. This was important for the covenant, as it ensured that the covenant blessing remained within Abraham's line, which makes a lot of sense. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. The genealogy's placement here links chapter 22 and chapter 24, which recounts the search for a wife for Isaac. So we'll talk about it again in 24 when the link is actually created. But I thought it was worth reading because it makes it make sense. Otherwise, anybody who reads the Bible knows that this is weird. For this to be here randomly is weird. It doesn't make sense. It's very abnormal. Genealogies are very predictable in the Bible because they're done pretty much the same way and in the same place always. This is one of very few that is just odd. So the explanation is good. And then when you get to 24 and you look at it, it does make a lot of sense because you get the recounting of the search of the wife of Isaac. So it all comes full circle. This passage echoes Christ on the cross, and it is a piece that is interpreted by many people who argue different atonement theories. Elaborate, maybe. I don't disagree though. I think that's an interesting way to look at it. Yeah. I wouldn't mind hearing your elaboration on that. God is kind. I don't disagree. I think that's worth talking about. I have to run though. I have a wild day tomorrow, so I got to do some stuff tonight. But left field speculation: could bind or bound be a metaphor for adhering to an idea religion, etc., assuming this event was a personified metaphor, which I'm honestly not sure about. Yes, in my opinion, yes, which counts for nothing. So anybody else, take it or leave it. I think it is definitely possible. Yeah, I have thought about this as well. This is one that I mean, this is most of the Bible I struggle with, but this is one that, yeah, I've thought about it, because if you look at it from a metaphorical perspective, you can make a lot of other things make sense, which is a whole nother conversation. But short answer, yes. In my opinion, I'm with you on it. But I also see the literal side of it as well. I see and acknowledge that it could very much be as literal as anything else in the Bible, which means not exactly literal, but literal enough. Literal enough.
I think it's just kind of like an attempt to calm our own nerves, and what's actually going on here, and sugarcoat. But I don't even know how this made this in the Bible. I can't believe, you know what I mean? Like, I can't believe this is not something they threw out.
I do. This and other things, like the thing with Lot and the daughters. I mean, there's a handful of them that would have made a lot of sense when you were removing stuff, to go ahead and take those bad boys out. Yeah,
it's just, I don't want it to be like I was saying, in terms of descriptive versus prescriptive, is just that, like, they did make mistakes. They're not perfect. And I think sometimes people, put them in the same category as Jesus or something, like, oh, they did this, and try to justify certain things. I think there was someone on one of your social media accounts who tried to downplay what happened with Lot and his daughters. And I'm like, whoa.
Yeah, I read that.
No, wrong is wrong. That's disgusting.
Yes. Yes.
And you don't downplay it just because of who the person is. Like, I don't know why people do that. But it's just concerning. So I just feel like it's always like a disclaimer I have to put out there.
Yeah, no, it's important. I feel like only, and I don't mean this to sound the way that it's definitely going to sound. I feel like it's the low IQ that do that.
Yeah.
Not to be a dick, but that's what I believe. The people who really think, I don't think you need to be super smart. I just think you have to actually think. And if you actually think, you don't view the Bible like that. Like, dude, that's such a childish way to look at the book. It's an archaic text. If we did things the way they did them, like, what the F would the world look like? It's in no way like the Bible is not, which is why the whole inerrancy of the Bible thing is just like this weird lie that is just perpetuated and perpetuated. It's not, dude. Like, it's not. You're delusional if you think it hasn't been touched at all. It's perfect. We just found parts of it not that long ago. It's not perfect. We don't hold the perfect Bible. We hold the best that we've got. Like, that I'll agree to. It's the same people who then are like, well, they did this, so we can do that. That's not how you read that. That's not how that works. Like, the directives in the Bible are very clear. They're very clear, and they're very few. The prescriptive parts of the Bible are very few, but they encompass everything. It's like the whole Ten Commandments thing, the golden rule. You take these small. If you take the Ten Commandments and the golden rule, as Ghost calls it, you cover virtually everything on a moral front, which then covers most other things on a down the line. But yeah, no, I agree. It's an important disclaimer to always give. Okay, it's sad that what?
We have to.
It's extremely sad that we have to, yeah. But exactly what you said on Instagram. I read that comment by that guy, and I was like, I'm not even gonna pretend to want to be a part of that at all. It's just, but that's low IQ. That's why I don't respond to comments on Instagram most of the time. I'll like heart things, but that's it, because I don't want to be a part of like a low IQ conversation. It's very rare. And because it was one of my things that when I started doing this again, almost 2 years ago now, I was like, I'm not going to argue with people on the internet ever again. And I've broken it a few times, but I've been very, very good about it otherwise. It's just not worth it. It's not productive. I'm just going to keep trying to put out
there,
positive stuff. What? It's crazy. It's just crazy. The stuff that people write on Instagram specifically, it's just crazy. It's absolutely nuts. And it's very sad. And it's why I have such an apathetic view of Christianity. But it's also a very small sample size. I also understand that. And And anytime we do all this, my faith is restored in humanity very quickly. So, okay, with that, I gotta go. I got stuff I gotta go do. I love you guys very, very much. And Thursday, continuing Adam and Eve. And just remember, stuff is finally actually happening, which is very exciting because it was very circular before this week. And then all of a sudden, the hammer was dropped. So it should be good. Very stoked. All right.